Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are back. This is Mike Cologne. This is episode 106 of the Mike and Maven podcast. If you haven't checked out episode 105, it was a really fun one. It's not my first law enforcement interview, but it was my first time speaking with the federal agent, Bob Starkman, who has a new book out called Inside Both Courts, talked about being a customs agent in Miami during the cocaine cowboys era of the 1980s and the many big busts he was on, interactions with the cast of Miami Vice, and his friendship with the legendary Joe Pistone, a.k.a. Donnie Brasco, from the 1997 movie was made of. So if you haven't seen that episode, please go check it out. It was a lot of fun. This episode's a little bit different. You know, we like to talk to everybody here in the Mike and Maven podcast. I often jokingly refer to this show as a Swiss Army knife podcast because we could talk to anyone on a week-to-week, episode-to-episode basis. So from a customs agent who is taking down cocaine dealers in Miami to my next guest, who's not your average Esquire, not a lawyer in the ilk of Johnny Cochran or Bill Kunstler, who's going to get you off some major criminal charge. He's a corporate lawyer instead, which is just as valuable. Instrumental in over 150 mergers, he served as president of the Walden Group, a firm specializing in mergers for over 25 years now. However, it's his most recent work as an author that is making waves. The author of a heartfelt memoir titled Smooth River, Finding Inspiration and Exquisite Beauty During Terminal Illness. His book centers on his wife's terminal cancer diagnosis and the admirable way in which they tackle dealing with such an end-of-life challenge and obstacle and the many things that come with it. And not only is it a book that centers on dealing with challenges of that nature, but any major challenges that come our way in life. His name is Richard Cohen, and he joins us now on the Mike and Maven podcast. Richard, welcome. How are you?
I'm fine. Honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So first, we'll begin. Where'd you grow up, and take me through what your early years were like?
Born in the Bronx, raised in Jackson Heights until second grade when my parents moved to Long Island. I had a pretty linear progression. Then high school, played sports, a sideline. I came in third in New York State in the quarter mile when I was a senior in high school in 1970. Went to college, went to law school, joined a law firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions, then was hired by a client, went to business school at night to learn accounting, finance, and business operations, and through a number of other settlements. I now, not as a lawyer, but I advise companies in either selling or buying medical technology companies, medical device or medical diagnostic companies. All of that, if I may, involves complicated, regulated subjects and several underlying skill sets. They're technical skill sets, but an important one is being trustworthy and operating as a fiduciary on behalf of our clients and doing the right thing by way of legal compliance.
So where did the initial interest in wanting to be a lawyer start for you?
In those days, this was 1974, I graduated college. It was just a regular kind of a track. Doctor, lawyer, a couple of other professions. It wasn't, I wouldn't say it was a love. Actually, I backed away from the law. I'm still a lawyer, but I don't practice. I love being in operations. I love the creativity of bringing together many different disciplines. I love entrepreneurial, companies and companies that make their own way and pave a new course. I've always been somewhat, creative, and it's funny. My major in college wasn't even a traditional major. It was cobbled together as a creative measure. It was called Science, Technology, and Society, and that's kind of what I'm doing now because I work in healthcare, but not as a doctor. And that's what I studied then. I was studying dialysis, having patients be part human and part machine, having their blood purified by a machine. So it's funny that early on, I had this mindset that was inchoate. I never realized it, but I'm doing now what I had this independent study and major in college.
So law school can be, and we're talking with Richard Cohen here in the Mike and Maven podcast. We're happy to have him. His new book is titled Smooth River finding inspiration and exquisite beauty during terminal illness, which we'll be discussing at length in just a moment. So staying the course during law school, because, law school is a lengthy process. It's not, even going to college for 2 years for your associates or 4 years for your bachelor's or master's can take a lot out of you. But I imagine that being in law school even more so. So during those rough moments when you're just cramming through textbooks and trying to make sure that you get everything that you need to done for school, how does one stay the course and not just give up because of how much is involved in law school towards eventually, of course, becoming a lawyer?
It was a rat race. There was a movie made, I forgot the name of it, Paper Chase, I think, or something like that. It was very, very competitive. But like professional sports or pitcher, you have to stay, in your zone. You have to stay in your in your style. You just burrow in and do it. So it wasn't. I didn't feel. Nowadays, I think the latitude of vocation is broader. Back then, I think it was much more narrow, and I just felt that was something I had to do. I was heavily influenced, by my father, not in any mandatory way, but he was a World War II veteran and went to business school, law school at night in St. John's before that, and ended up being an accountant. And so that professional aspect has rubbed off on me. And the aspect of tending to other people was also something that influenced me.
So you began your law career initially at the law firm of Wachtel, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, which of course also specializes in mergers. It deals with the same things. As you probably checked out some of my previous interviews, when I sit down with these individuals from law enforcement and the fire service, the thing I often ask them is, when you were coming on the job, who were the senior men that taught you the job? And so similarly, being around, I imagine, a law firm of experienced individuals who had dealt with these types of things for years, how did that help you either directly or indirectly, just through sheer observance, refine your skills as an esquire, especially in that field?
Well, I don't want to mention names. Wachtel, in those days, Wachtel and a firm called Skadden-Arps were the two gunslinger law firms that were well known for friendly and hostile mergers and acquisitions. In those days, the tender offer rules were light, so you can acquire a company in 7 days. What worked for me at Wachtel was the deep, profound, sincere trust they put in you on your first day. I walked in, I remember walking in to my office for the first day, and there was an American Express credit card there. I said, they're trusting me with that card? And it was yes. I often found myself in meetings as a first year or second year associate across the table with some Skadden-Arps senior partners, and we were really thrown into the deep end. And with expectations, to serve our clients' interests and check all the boxes, which I did. But there were some great role models there, and at other firms too. So there was this creativity and nose to the grindstone, and maybe with an athletic analogy, just to up the game a little bit, to form new ways of combining companies compliant with the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations. So all of that was a little bit of a high. It was 24/7 work, and I eventually left after a couple of years, like I said, to join a client that was a corporate acquisition company that actually did the acquisitions.
So one more thing on your career as an esquire, and then we'll dive into your outstanding book, which we'll be discussing at length momentarily. Take me through some of the more notable negotiations, because these are important mergers, and sometimes there's people who are in favor, some people who are not. But nonetheless, when you can recall like some of the bigger companies that you've dealt with, what comes to mind?
This is so early in my career, and I'm somewhat removed from Wachtel. I'm very friendly with the people, so I'd rather not go there. Although some of the mergers were there were proxy fights involving I think the Hollywood Bowl. There was T. Boone Pickens. He was a Texas oil man trying to take over Texaco. I think. There were United Technologies buying Carrier. That was a friendly acquisition. There was a major acquisition by a few Middle Eastern investors to take over a bank holding company called Financial General Bank Shares. I got to fly the Concorde, and Clark Clifford, who was the defense secretary under Johnson, this goes way back. He formed his own firm called Clifford and Warnke, and they hired Wachtel as security, as their security arm. And I remember, so this was a group of Middle Eastern investors trying to take over a multi-state bank holding company. Now they're legal, but then this was a grandfather company. And I remember taking a limousine with Marty Lipton, the head of our firm, and Clark Clifford in the limousine, and another person. And Clark Clifford, everybody called him Mr. Clifford, was asking everybody in the limousine about, we were going down to the New York State Department of Banking. Muriel Siebert was the superintendent then, for a major hearing about whether they would approve this takeover. And Clark Clifford went around the limousine asking people's opinions. I think I was a first-year associate. And then he said to me, "Richard, what do you think?" So it was that element of being thrown into deep water and having to rise to the occasion that was a great inspiration to me, and still is a driver to meet the occasion.
And that segues perfectly now into our discussion about your book, Meeting the Occasion, Rising to the Occasion, which is what you and your wife were able to do during a very difficult situation. So first, for those of us who unfortunately did not have the great privilege to know who your wife was, I mean, she sounded like an outstanding individual. Why don't you tell us about her?
So her name is Marcia Horowitz. She grew up in Manhattan Beach. Her father, too, was a World War II veteran who, with U.S. Army surplus, formed a surgical supply business in Manhattan across from the 28th Street Armory. Marcia went to college. She got a MA, a master's degree in journalism, and her first job, she's only got 2 jobs in her life. Her first job was with Mayor A. Beam, way back when. He was in a very small press office, and Marcia worked in that press office. Marcia was, full of humor. This was funny, but actually happened. In those days, there were no copying machines. We used carbon paper. And so she was responsible for delivering Mayor Beam's State of the City speech while he gave the speech in front of City Hall. Unfortunately, she gave him 2-page 12s. And so when he read the speech to the press corps, he didn't notice it, but everybody else noticed that he was saying the same thing twice. Okay, having said that, after 2 or 3 years in the press office, Howard Rubenstein plucked her out, and that was her only other job, Mayor Beam and Howard Rubenstein. She worked for Rubenstein Associates, and Howard and his son, Stephen, who runs the firm for over 41 years. You know Howard from Steinbrenner and other sports and other clients. Now, Marcia and Rubenstein, but Marcia represented crisis clients. At one point, when the firm was smaller, she headed the law firm department, the business financial department, and the crisis communications department. She represented, in the background, celebrities, sportscasters, major figures, major corporations in times of crisis and need. For instance, I can't mention names, but she was very close with Nick Buonaconti and Miami Project, with his son having spinal cord injury. She was very close with Jacques Cousteau. She was very close with current NBA players and the like. But she also represented some large corporations, feeder funds from the Madoff debacle, private schools, public universities, nonprofits, all within the throes of some problem. Could be a workplace, sex type problem, or it could be a financial problem. But the core to all of this was finding calm within the storm. And Marcia had an inimitable way of reducing very, very complex material through a pinhole so that the press and the public would understand it. When clients, just like we'll talk about, pancreatic cancer, when clients are going through trouble where the founder of the company did something wrong, and Marcia is counseling them to hire or bring on an independent board to give the problem objective review, but the board members are taking the side of the founder, even though that will hurt the company or school's long-term promise. Marcia was able to navigate the picture and gently advise companies to do the right thing and to think about their long-term health. So this clarity, this weeding out of extraneous distortion, the tendency to cover things up or sweep things under the rug, it never works. So a good public relations, a crisis management person needs to bite the bullet. Oftentimes, the press are one-sided, or an aggressive reporter could want to hang his or her hat on some piece. So the public relation person's job is to fill out the perspective, add the other side of the story, and try to get the full picture out. So her ethos was, clarity, objectivity, trying to get the full picture out, no spin, no BS, despite all those elements that are sometimes attributed to public relations people. She played it straight.
Richard Cohen is our guest here in the Mike Demand podcast, and you need people like that. Sometimes being a straight shooter doesn't have the best ring to it, or it doesn't strike people as maybe the best quality to have, but it's what you need to be sometimes. You need to be blunt, you need to be straightforward, and sometimes dumping that proverbial cold water on someone is the best way to get them to deal with whatever the situation at hand is, because it puts it in real terms, and so it's not I think, and I've had this experience in how I've grown up. Sometimes people seek to be nice. The intention isn't bad. You don't want to hurt somebody. You don't want to make things worse than they already are. But at the same time, you want their eyes to be open. I think the worst thing you can do is to not be straightforward, because it doesn't give that person the realistic perspective they need to counter whatever the situation may be.
And a lot of her clients were surrounded themselves with sycophants who told them, what they wanted to hear.
Right.
But the donors, or how the client would fare in a year or two from now, what we're doing now will affect how this company or university's fate in the long term. Mm-hmm. So she took the long view on behalf of the company, on behalf of the client or company.
So take me through, and you and I both unfortunately have experience with this, that initial shock of learning of her diagnosis. It's not easy. I'll never forget, for example, sitting in my old apartment here in New Haven, Connecticut, where I used to live, and my mom telling me, okay, I have cervical cancer. And it just, as an 8-year-old, it shocks you, because you kind of have an idea at that point. It doesn't matter what age you are. If you're old enough to comprehend, you understand the magnitude of the moment. So when that moment came for you, take me through, I guess, that initial stage.
So this was in July of 2019. We had just come back from an incredible trip to the Middle East, being hosted by a Palestinian mother of 4 PhD. And we came back in mid-July 2019, and Marcia had some unrelated stomach pain, which her GI thought might be some various stomach ailments that antibiotics would treat. Didn't go away, and then toward August, she was given a blood test, and then on Memorial Day weekend of 2019, her GI said, we need you to come in for a CAT scan the day after Memorial Day. That was September 3rd. So she did that, and about an hour after the CT scan, the GI called that he wanted to see us both in his office that afternoon. So, we weren't blind. As I say in the book, Marcia laughingly lived by Woody Allen's quote, the best term is you want to hear is not "I love you," but it's benign. So we had this, cancer fear, and the doctor was going through the motions of delivering, bad news. We felt that. So we took the walk from the coffee shop to his office in Manhattan, and then he came in a little late. He didn't make eye contact with us. He sat down and then delivered the news that Marcia has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and you may have heard of it, but its details, but it's there are no diagnostic tests to assess the onset of pancreatic cancer. So most patients get diagnosed with it in stage 4, meaning after the cancer has spread to other organs, meaning there's no surgery available. So we were in his office, and it was, as you said, a shock. I used the analogy, like the room filled with pesticide vapor. Marcia was 67, I was 66, and it was a shock. There's no getting around it. I drove my car back to our house in Westchester County and had to grip the wheel like driver's education, and we were in free fall those first 3 days. There's no getting around it. Then we started scheduling appointments after day 3, and we gained some footing. And the critical point of all this, the approach that we developed or that came upon us organically, was the same approach Marcia took in business, which is clarity. Give it to me straight. I don't want to be spun. I want to know what my longevity is. I want to know what the treatment options are, and what the side effects are, and how long I'm going to live. She was very clear. She did not want to be treated as a tragedy. That was clear. And we carried that out. So what we did was we then saw a number of doctors. We felt more comfortable after we saw doctors. Not that we thought there was the treatments for stage 4 pancreatic cancer were promising. They aren't. The 2 chemos, we took all the powerful chemos, did everything. Each of them only has a 20 to 30% shot at working. And those are clinical trial results which are highly, highly qualified. So the mindset we came to was to accept reality, to do all we can, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. There was a fork in the road we came to. We could live helter-skelter, being overwhelmed by everything, and be self-pitying and just lose our bearings. I think it's a logical response. Or we could accept our circumstances, not romanticize them, not be happy about it. We were very sad about it, but we wanted to put the pancreatic cancer and the treatment within a wider life plan, so that we're prepared and we can live out Marcia's remaining time as best we could. And that could be, 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, or 30 years. We didn't know what it would be, but we wanted to be, prepared, and we didn't want to be blindsided at the end by, cheerleaders or doctors or friends or family not addressing the elephant in the room. We wanted to address it.
And there's one portion in the book, and this is something that was so touching to me, amongst many aspects of it that were touching, is that you talked about, of course, you mentioned, of course, having a realistic approach, but also a good attitude. Because at any given time that crisis comes our way, it's easy to focus on the negatives. And, it's obviously with there being so many negatives and the one big negative staring you in the face, you can be hard pressed to find the positives. But in your case, although, like you said, you were realistic, I found that approach to be to be incredibly refreshing, to seek out the positives and to still take joy in that. So for anybody that's going through a hard time, how important, however small they may be, is it in your eyes, through your experience, to stop and take stock in the good things in life, whatever they may be?
Well, definitely. I mean, that's an aphorism or a well-known principle for advice for people to take. There's some more flesh on it here when we're talking about real people. This is, for instance, I'm going to speak in the plural. This was our life, like, or anybody else who's experiencing terminal illness or some big obstacle. This is your life. You want the rest of your life, or the remaining time, whatever it is, to be in the throes of a tsunami. We can't control the results. Medicine doesn't have answers to everything, but we could control how we saw things. What we came to was our lives are bigger than the medical condition or the process of our dying. It's just a subset of our life. So our lives are bigger. If we were to be overwhelmed, we would not be making poor use of Marcia's remaining time. Instead, we shock absorbed, everything. We didn't get overtaken by every negative test result, and every test result was negative. We just absorbed it along the way. We had hoped for Marcia to live through Thanksgiving of that year, then Christmas, then her birthday on January 7th of 2020, and maybe through the birth of her new granddaughter in June of that year. But by seeing the bigger picture, that her life, our lives are bigger than the event that may cause our death, is important. Our lives are bigger. Our lives shouldn't be defined by how we die. We've done more. We've been on earth here for more than the action of dying. We are all going to die. It's going to happen. We all put it off in the future and don't even think about it. Doctors have a hard time discussing it with patients. But to come to grips with this when you have to is vitally important. We would have foregone some critical moments. Mike, this is going to sound very, very strange, but the final weeks were the most beautiful time in my life. When you get closer to death, life becomes more vital, it becomes more intense, and the smaller things take on more meaning. We call it miracles of the mundane. Serene candlelight dinners, watching music, or putting ourselves on a nature walk, overwhelming ourselves with the wonders of a river or a forest. These were all critical components. I watched Marcia's eyes through this whole experience, or the way she was taking things in. It was as if she was experienced, a river, a forest, a walk for the very first time, like she was coming in from a planet, because she now could appreciate everything that she was going to lose. So I am not saying this is stoical. I'm not saying this is, we were robots. I was going to say it's not easy, but in a lot of ways, it isn't difficult either. You don't need to be a crisis manager, to open up to reality. What is the other option is to put on blinders, to fool yourselves or listen to. I'm not blaming doctors. It's all part of human nature. But all of us are susceptible to avoiding the elephant in the room, difficulty in tackling hard subjects, and death and dying is still one of those subjects that that we avoid. So we could have gone helter-skelter and worried about everything and being, subjected to people worrying about us or even, looking down on us. We did the opposite. All we did was seek clarity, openness, value our lives, and we tried to serve as a role model to people around us, even our doctors. There's so much written. Atul Gawande, he's an author and wrote this great book, Being Mortal, and there's a PBS Frontline special on it about the difficulty doctors have in discussing end-of-life matters, because doctors are trained on fixing the thing, the condition, less so about treating the entire patient. So it was just critically important to put everything on the table, discuss everything, be open-minded. It does not mean forgoing any treatment. Although at the end, as Atul Gawande mentions in regard to his own father, you may not want to do the third round of chemo if it's doing nothing. The critical point is valuing your remaining time and living it comfortable. As his father mentioned, he's not afraid of death. What he is worried about is pain in the process. So, and there's this other book, if I might.
That's fine. Yeah, go right ahead.
I studied this in college. This is part of my independent study. This is called On Death and Dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, written about 1970, I think. What the Dying Have to Teach Doctors, Nurses, Clergy, and Their Own Families. She started hospice care. She was the forerunner. And she opened up this conversation where the dying could teach us what their desires are, rather than putting them in a closet and projecting what we think they think. So this concept of addressing end of life, being comfortable with it, tending to the dying, but it could be somebody else without even a medical issues, in the throes of some crisis, just being open about it and being able to discuss it on their terms is critically important. We have, societal bents for treating illness as a sport or as war. Fight like hell, fight like hell, fight like hell. And it's okay to do that, but not if it's going to blind you from your broader life. Not if it's going to make you do treatments that cause more harm than good. Doctors are used to treatment, and it's painful when some treatments don't work. Some of them, this is well known. There are a lot of studies. There's another book called, I think it's called Conversations at Midnight, where the author said that the doctor was so bummed out when his treatment or surgery didn't work. She's the one who had to console him. She's the one who had to get him off the hook. She's the one who had to, model behavior so he could be placated when he should be doing that to her. So part of, the book is important. It's not a memoir. It's not to call attention to Marcia or me. It's rather to call attention to the need to normalize these end-of-life discussions and to treat patients who succeed in treatment and people who don't, and give them their due. Because again, their lives are broader and more important than the way it ends.
Absolutely. And that part of the book hit me on two levels, two prongs. One, I was having this conversation with my friend Jim Carano, who's a retired NYPD bomb squad detective, and he worked, you may recall the detective Louis Alvarez. He worked with him in the bomb squad. And
yep.
Louis went through 68 rounds of chemo from his 9/11 related cancers through digging at the pile at ground zero. And unfortunately, he ended up passing away from that. But how did he spend his final days? Was he sulking? No, he was helping fellow first responders and doing for them and lifting their spirits. When it, as you just said, it should have been the other way around. And the other example is, I mentioned being 8 when I found out my mom had cervical cancer. Thankfully, she survived it. She's still with us. She survived breast cancer too, and that woman's indestructible. So, but the other lesson was when I was 9, not too long after that. I learned that my buddy Massimo, we called him Max, had bone cancer. We kept falling down in gym class. Nobody knew why, and kind of like you mentioned earlier, Marcia having that pain, she couldn't really trace it. He went to get some tests and he found out in early 2009 that he had that. And by June of 2009, he was gone. And that was the first person I ever lost in my life. And I was 9 years old. So that was my first real experience with death of somebody that I cared about deeply. But what amazes me is that if you look back through the home videos, much like you talked about with Marcia, he wasn't sulking. He wasn't sad. He knew what he had. He knew he didn't have that much time left, but he was dancing around, being a kid, being a regular 9-year-old, laughing and joking. And, that always stuck with me because he didn't, as you talked about earlier, not letting the death define one's life. He didn't let his disease nor his impending death, which occurred in that June, define his life. And so, it amazes me how people have that internal fortitude. And those people, I think, as I'm sure you'll agree, are really the best of us in society.
Well, yes, but I would hope that approach could be more prevalent, because there are too many people that are overwhelmed, by the experience. Look, we were constantly told during Marcia's illness by doctors and nurses that the way we were managing her illness was different, was more uplifting. And then she passed. I hate to give that short shrift, but then my people who were bereavement counselors told me to go on to these curated sites. One was called stage 4 pancreatic cancer. One was called terminal illness, loss of a spouse, all sorts of, death and dying affinity groups on Facebook and otherwise. And what I experienced there was extraordinary pain and lack of structure and no bearings or little bearings. Not all the time, but it was enough for me to motivate me to write something up about our experience to help other people. So I first had in mind something called a white paper that medical device or diagnostic firms write up, short of a clinical trial, but it's a erudite piece. And I thought I'd write that up. Because along the way, I created copious notes and a log, not just of all our medical events, but also of her life events. So her doctors can see the fullness of a life and not just management of the thing, the cancer itself. But I spoke to a friend of mine who used to work for Simon & Schuster and suggested I write this book. And so that's how it took shape. It's very much a desire to help other people in my capacity to publicize or propagate this approach. This approach is a fork in the road. It's, in one sense, it's complicated, as you inferred or implied, but in another sense, it's a question of whether we're going to deal with reality or we're going to ignore it. Or are we going to fool ourselves, or are we going to go into things head on? It doesn't really change the treatment. It might, but just one is opening up to reality or practical probabilities rather than putting blinders on. Because putting blinders on not only shortchanges this critical last phase of our lives, but can lead to devastating surprises at the end. It could be personal relationships or wounds that are left untended to. There could be legal consequences that are untended to, family, and all sorts of things. If I might, we developed this life plan along the way. So this was what may I get into that, Mike?
Sure.
Yeah. So, Marcia, we dedicated, at her suggestion, we dedicated an hour or so no deadline, in the afternoon every day, in our sunroom, to have these open-ended life and death discussions where, she asked, how am I going to die? What's going to be like? What is death? What does dying feel like? Everything. But by doing so, by dedicating a certain room and a certain time to address these, painful subjects, it enabled her for the rest of the day to go about her business. I mean, everything, it was still on her mind, of course, but she was able to read books and watch Netflix and speak to her office, without fear that she was not talking about these gravid subjects. So by dedicating time to it, really, freed her up for the rest of the day to a large extent, but B, gave voice to these intangible issues that are roiling in both of our heads. I mean, there's a line in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the movie that Tom Hanks was in, that said, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. Meaning, if you give voice to something, you put borders around these, scary, loose-ended thoughts. So that's what we did. We, dedicated time every afternoon, and it softened things. The other thing we did, we did a lot of things. It's called in the life plan, is we tried to get out every afternoon to walk along the Hudson River, or the Long Island Sound, or taking nature walks, or a drive on a country road, or getting tea and donuts someplace we've never been to. We just tried to we try to overwhelm ourselves with nature and rise above the cancer and get out of the cancer regimen and just experiencing life. We also set up certain projects. We formed a nonprofit on our own. This Palestinian woman who hosted us in the Middle East, we discussed forming a nonprofit that would help build bridges among people of disparate backgrounds. So during this period, frankly, with the help of people in the office of Senators Gillibrand and Schumer, we formed Marcia's Light Foundation. And this woman, this Palestinian woman, under the banner of Marcia's Light, has helped train Palestinian women in Israel on computer skills so they could help their children gain access to virtual schooling and gain other occupational skills, and that's still going on there. Here we were involved with a nonprofit called Mentoring in Medicine that helps African American and Hispanic students gain access to medical school and other healthcare professions. So we doubled down in our involvement with that nonprofit during her illness. Another one was El Centro Hispano, which does the same for the Hispanic population. So all of these pursuits, trying to rise above the cancer, do things for other people, do good things that helped us feel good about ourselves and regain the conviction and the principles and the bedrock of who we were critically important. Now, if we succumb to everything and everything was woe is me, we had plenty of woe is me time, by the way. But if we succumb to the other approach, we wouldn't have experienced any of that. One more anecdote, if I might. My office is in Tarrytown, New York. So one of the walks we took was on the Hudson River shoreline in Tarrytown. And Tarrytown is about 35 miles north of New York City. And it's a beautiful area. But 10 or 20 years ago, Tarrytown and other river towns reclaimed industrial sites to make it an esplanade and riverside walkways with lovely plantings and rocks, etc. So Marcia and I used to walk that often. It's a 3-mile wide expanse. Tarrytown was the home of Washington Irving, who wrote Headless Horseman and Rip Van Winkle, and it had some steep in history. The river is 3 miles wide, gorgeous. Sunsets, Palisades are on the other side. And underneath the bridge, you can see the skyline and the Freedom Tower all the way down. It's gorgeous. In any event, I noticed some people sitting on rocks right on the river. And I suggested to the village administrators if we could build an honor bench for Marcia while she was alive. Not to accelerate her death, but I wanted Marcia to understand, just like Marcia's Life Foundation, projects that we are doing now that will build us foundations to carry on her legacy in the hereafter. So I suggested a bench in a prosaic site on the banks of the Hudson River to the city of Tarrytown. They didn't respond to me, but a couple of weeks later, they said we have a better idea, and they said we're going to situate this bench on a bluff, gorgeous scenic view on a bluff on the Hudson, and we're going to make it an honor memorial bench area with Marcia's being the first. So it's gorgeous. Marcia didn't see it final, but she saw where it was, and now I've seen weddings taking place on it. It's a scenic place where people take pictures, kids climbing all over it. It's just teeming with life. So, part of our life plan was to, develop these projects, get out of the house, have these heart-rending conversations dedicated, and even take some trips. We took, 2 trips to Florida. We bought a fixer-upper house near Clearwater, in the Tampa area, where there are, I think the Yankees and the Blue Jays and the Phillies have their spring training facilities. We bought a fixer-upper house, and we got there twice. It's on the water. We have dolphins in our backyard. Just getting out there was important. Her traipsing through the airports, the second time she needed wheelchairs, but just trying to normalize things was very important. Walks around the block were important. We don't notice a lot of things when we're driving past things, past these sites, quickly when we're racing back and forth. But when time is short, as I said before, life becomes more intense, and you start to notice things you've never noticed and appreciate things you've never appreciated before. So I'll stop here for now, but there's more. But this is, part of how we invested her remaining time. Now, if we took the other route, if we weren't mindful of the bigger picture and her longevity, we wouldn't have experienced that. We would have just been in that pressure cooker. And as I said before, the last week or two, or the entire experience were beautiful. Even her last week were beautiful. Even her last day was beautiful.
Absolutely. And then one thing, you don't have to worry about time. I often say the longer the guest talks, the better it is. This is their story, and however they want to tell it, it's fine by me. I'm just happy that they're here. So, we talked about, and you've mentioned frequently throughout the show, and it's been a very powerful show, and I'm really glad that you're here, about how you want this book to help anybody in any situation. I feel the timing of the book is also really good because what's been happening the last year, the pandemic, and that has done so much damage to people, not just on the physical level in terms of those who may have contracted COVID or those who know somebody who's contracted COVID, but also obviously it takes a toll on one emotionally. Have I had COVID? Thankfully not. But being locked down, dealing with that crisis, those who may have lost employment, obviously those who may have lost loved ones to this disease or seen them severely impacted by it. If they haven't lost their battle with the disease, obviously they're never going to be the same because of the damage that it does. So in terms of not just terminal illness, but challenges of that nature, especially with what we've endured in the last almost 2 years now, how do you hope that the book can help people not only now in this rough patch, but also continuing down the road in the aftermath, as we discussed at this point?
Okay. I say in the book, the quote lessons of the book are more inferential rather than frontal. They're not like, here are the 10 points, do this, do that, do this. Because it's important to see the flesh of how Marcia and I experienced her remaining months, so that other people can derive their own specifics in this approach. But what I would say, just loosely, first of all, my heart goes out to everyone that you just mentioned, all of the COVID, all people touched by COVID. I think I saw an amazing statistic that gets lost. I think some 600,000 people in the United States have passed already, have died. It's just incredible. There's no making light of it, and some people have cancer for years before succumbing. Some people, it's in remission and reverses. Some people are the victims of crime. My close friend was riding a bike and he had some brain injury, and it was so quick, there was no time to spend this remaining time I'm mentioning. I guess the underlying message, and it's not a quick fix, so I don't mean to be pulling something out of a hat. It's much more inferential, and it's very specific to the person involved. But I think one big picture is that one's life is just bigger than how one dies. And one's life is bigger than even the negative circumstances we're going through now. Whatever they are, however bad they are, this is our life. We're all going to die. We're all going to be here for a short period of time, relatively speaking. And we have a choice to try to make the best of it. Some circumstances are really hard. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying, it's challenging. It is challenging. But this critical point of the way we die, or some problem, could be a business problem that we are subjected to, is a subset of our life. It's a subset. It's not our entire life. And we have the power to identify our lives the way we want them to be identified, and our loved ones who have died too. And if they didn't have the time to flesh that out, their survivors can. So I think it's, I found it, I'm changed. I'm deeply moved, by this, whole experience. And just a critical feature is that life is bigger than any one predicament or crisis or medical condition. And we, as hard as it may be, this is our life. We get to write it, or we get to write the legacy of people who have left us. And let's not shortchange it. Let's optimize it. Let's carry on that legacy. Let's make that life a blessing. Let's make our lives a blessing by carrying on that legacy.
Absolutely. Richard Cohen has been our guest in the Mike Maven podcast. The book is Smooth River, Finding Inspiration and Exquisite Beauty During Terminal Illness. I always like to conclude on a lighthearted note with a segment called Rapid Fire. It's 5 hit-and-run questions from me and 5 answers from you. Are you ready?
I'm scared, but okay.
And you can say pass if you want. First, and you could say multiple. Funniest colleague or colleagues you ever worked with?
I'm going to pass.
All right, that's fine. Second, not just in relation to what we've been talking about for the last hour, just in general, best advice anyone ever gave you?
Think wide, think broadly. Don't narrow your thinking to just the condition at hand.
Third, favorite thing about Westchester?
The natural beauty, the Hudson River.
Absolutely. Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Oh, not there much. Gotham Bar.
Yeah, that makes sense. So fifth and finally, and I think this parlays perfectly into what we've discussed, and we've kind of covered some of it, but you can add something if you want. Knowing what you know now, if you could go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would you tell a young Richard Cohen?
Oh, wow. Great question. Appreciate everything. Hang your ego at the door. Don't get hung up with small stuff. look people in the eye and see the meaning in everybody and the meaning in everything. Appreciate everything, and maybe live life with an understanding that it will end at some point. Not in crisis, but in appreciation of what's before us.
All right. And that concludes what's been a really emotional and but really important episode of the Mike Green podcast. This was episode 106. Richard, his book, of course, is The Smooth River, as I mentioned, and I'll put the link in the description of this video as well as in the description of the audio version of the podcast. Is there any, besides the book, of course, is there any other shout outs to anybody in particular you'd like to give, family, friends? If so, fire away.
Well, everybody, my family and everybody that surrounded, Marcia and I, but you, Mike, I want to, I've listened to all your podcasts, not all of them, but many of your podcasts, and this may be a little bit off kilter to a certain extent. I want to praise you for opening up this subject and giving it voice. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for coming on and making the time. And I'm really glad that you were here. So for those of you out there that may be first-time listeners, you can find me on social media. On Twitter, I am at Mike New Haven, Instagram, original_MC1, and LinkedIn, just type in Mike Cologne, then MIC', which is the first word of the podcast to connect with me. Business lines for sports, 917-727-0891. For other inquiries, 917-781-6189. Emails, sports, Cologne on sports, COLON on sports@gmail.com, or the Cologne Report for other inquiries, THECOLON report@gmail.com. Coming up next week on the Mike Demaven podcast for episode 107, Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's arson, explosion, and bomb squad. It was a pipe bomb plot out in Brooklyn that was foiled at the last possible moment. Detective Richard Teamsville was one of the men that raided a Brooklyn apartment that evening to stop would-be terrorists from detonating pipe bombs in the Atlantic Avenue subway. He'll talk about that experience and more for what will be, again, Tales from the Boom Room, profiles of the NYPD's arson, explosion, bomb squad, volume 14. In the meantime, on behalf of Richard Cohen, I am Mike Cologne, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone.